Well, good morning, Rock Church. How's everybody doing? You good? Man, so good to see you guys today. I want to welcome those of you in the auditorium. As Matt said, I want to welcome those of you watching at C3 and then also watching online. It's just cool to know that we are a church that is physically meeting in a couple different locations right now, and God is just continuing just to work in our church. My name is Josh. If you happen to be new with us, I'm one of the pastors here, and just so excited just to have a conversation today about Jesus, and just to kind of see, one, what he believes about us, and then two, about how we should be living that out in our lives. This week, we're going to talk a lot about things that we see. And, this week in general, I've seen a lot, you know what I mean? And part of the things I mean by that is one, with the opening of the coffee bar, just seeing people come by, that's been awesome. With the work that has happened in our building this week with trees and plants and shrubs and paint and carpet, it's just really cool just to see all that happening. So those are some things I've seen. One thing I need to make sure you understand, you're going to start seeing things differently here on stage as well. This week we're going to start hanging our audio video stuff at our new building. So when you come in next week, you'll see a few things that aren't on this stage because they're being hung on that stage. Over the next couple weeks, we only have 2 more Sundays if everything goes right. All right, so we're going to pray that everything goes right, and we're going to work like everything's going to go right. But what you're going to see as you come to church over the next couple weeks is just the stage is just getting stripped down more and more because we're taking all of our equipment towards our new facility. All right, so you see that, and then there's other things that maybe you'll see coming up, but things I've seen this week. One thing I saw, which is just not good. As we just saw more crisis happen in America this week. And it's just been tough, when you see the loss of lives, whether that be in Minnesota, Louisiana, Dallas, and in other places. It's just tough. And I think that really helps us understand, especially if you were here last week, why this series is so important. I mean, we talked last week about, how to be a good neighbor, about how to love people, about how to know that the people who are different than you, who are maybe come from a different ethnic background than you, that people who live differently than you, that they are valuable, that all people are valuable. And, so that series that we started last week, that we're continuing today, I hope that we all catch how practical it is and how needed it is. Because right now, we need to do everything we can to love people. And that's really the crux of the message today is we're going to really look back at this story, the Good Samaritan. We're going to dive into a couple more passages or scriptures from it. But what we're really going to be able to pull from it is how this Samaritan, he saw a man in need, and it broke his heart, which then ended up moving his hands. If I could put it in other terms, I would say what you see should break your heart. What you feel should move our hands. And that's kind of the crux of the message today. So I want us to kind of just start by doing that and just talk about things that we see. Now, we're pretty good at seeing things and choosing to ignore them as people. Here's a perfect proof of that. How many of y'all have seen the speed limit sign and have chosen to ignore it? Yeah, you know what I'm saying? Like, we see things all the time and we choose to ignore them. We go to the ocean and we see the signs that say caution riptides, and I've ignored that every time I've ever seen it. I don't even know if I understand it. You know what I mean? I look at my Diet Coke can and it's got like warning label on it. Some of you smoke and there's warning labels there. And we look at those warning labels and we're like, you know what I mean? Like, we choose to ignore things that could bring us harm. I think about, roller coasters. Most of us totally ignore the signs on roller coasters, right? Because how many of y'all have seen the sign on a roller coaster that says, keep your hands inside the carts? But how many of y'all ride like this? Because it's the only way to ride. If you grabbing onto that bar, you're a sissy, okay? I'm just kind of letting you know that. We ride like this because this is the way to do it. Yet it's dangerous. I remember as a kid, a sign that I ignored every winter. You know, I grew up in the Midwest where it snows. I'm glad I don't live where it snows anymore, all right? But growing up in the Midwest, you know, Indianapolis city, and then you get on the suburbs, flat cornfields, all right? So that was kind of our backyard, even though I was like in the city, you know, I lived just down the street, you got cornfields, you know? And there was no hills, it's just flat land right there in central Indiana. And when it would snow, there was one place you could go sledding. It was where they had cut a railroad track through our town. And if you'd go to this railroad track, it was kind of cut in, so there was, you know, the sides, and you could sled down the sides that led to the railroad track. And we always knew exactly where to go, because if it snowed, all the neighborhood kids would go and would cut through this one guy's yard, would come to a fence, and at this fence was posted a sign that said, "No trespassing." And when you saw that sign, you knew you were at the right place. You'd hop the fence, go a little further, and that's where we'd all sled. Well, sure enough, I'm there that day. I've hopped the fence. I'm at the hill. We're sledding a little bit. And then all of a sudden, this dude shows up with a tractor inner tube. Anybody ever, like I know Horry County lifelong residents, you don't understand right now. But for those of you who grew up where it snowed, like you get on an inner tube, oh, it's party, you know what I mean? I didn't know that at the time, though, you know what I mean? I'm a little kid at the point, and this tractor inner tube is huge, and I'm like, dude, too big for me, so I look at my buddy David. I said, David, get on with me. So we sit down on this tractor inner tube. We're at the top of the hill. I'm looking down. My brother's at the bottom. I was like, hey, Jack, anything coming? And so he looks right and looks left. Nah. Now, here's reality. We really never needed to ever ask that question, okay? Because when you would go down this hill, it would level out before it get to the railroad track. You would never actually get to the railroad track. And besides that, there was trains that never went on this track. All right, so it was one of those, we would ask because we're safe kids. But we never had to worry about it. Well, that day we sit down on this inner tube. Jack, anything coming? Nah. So poof, we take off. And we're going down this hill, screaming, yelling, you know, like it's a 45-minute ride. Probably about, 5 seconds. You know what I mean? But go down, we get down to the bottom, and we've got momentum. And we're going towards the railroad track. And I'm like, David, this is the farthest we've ever been. Like world record. We went all the way to the track, hit the track, and bounced back about 3 feet. And then immediately an Amtrak passenger train, snow's flying up, landing on us. I mean, we are freaking out, just screaming like little schoolgirls. You know what I mean? Like snow piled up. Finally, the train gets past, and we kind of dig ourselves out of the yellow snow. That part's a joke, the yellow snow. But all this literally happened. We didn't speak. Carried that inner tube up to the top of the hill. I dropped it. I walked to that fence. I saw that sign. I jumped over that fence. I went home, and I never went back because that place scared me. I ignored signs, and by ignoring it, it almost brought my death. And how many times do we see people, yet we choose to ignore them. And because of that, we leave them at a place of death. Whether that be emotional death, physical death, or spiritual death. How many times do we see things and choose to ignore them? You see, that's what two guys in the story did. They saw, but they chose to ignore. But one guy saw, and he chose to jump in. Let me kind of tell you the story a little bit, and then I'll read a couple of the scriptures just to make sure we're all caught up to speed. So what happened is Jesus was kind of hanging out, and there was this guy that came to him, an expert in the law, and he wanted to kind of test Jesus. So he said, Jesus, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus said, well, you're an expert in the law. How do you read the law? And the guy said, well, the law says, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and then love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said, yeah, you've answered correctly. Well, the guy wanted to justify himself, so he looked back at Jesus and he said, well, who is my neighbor actually? And to that, then Jesus replied, and let's read it straight from the Bible, what it says here. It's Luke chapter 10, starting in verse 30. Jesus replied with this story. He said, a Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by some bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest came along, but when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to on the other side of the road and passed him by. A temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed by on the other side. Then a despised Samaritan came along. When he saw the man, he felt compassion for him and went over to him. The Samaritan went over to him. He recognized that he was beaten and bloody, and he bandaged up his wounds. He put him on his own donkey, and then he took him to an inn where he could care for his needs. The next morning, the Samaritan said, hey, here's some money. Let him stay here, and this money will cover his needs. I'll be passing back through. If he needs anything else or if he needs more money, then I'll gladly pay my dues at that point. What we see in the middle of this story is a guy who's beaten. He's left alone. He's on the side of the road. And some people came by and they saw him. But the pastor, the priest, the temple assistant, or the Levite, they saw the man and walked by on the other side. Why is it that sometimes we see people in need, but we choose to ignore? I think sometimes it's because of our own religiosity. And what I mean by that is it's almost like we're afraid to get dirty. I mean, think about this priest, this pastor. When he saw the man, he realized this guy's like half dead, maybe fully dead, and is covered in blood. And the priest is probably thinking, well, I'm on my way to the temple, and if I stop and help this guy, I could contaminate myself. I could make myself unclean, and then I won't be able to go and help others. I won't be able to go and do my Jesus thing. I won't be able to go and do my religious thing. I don't want to get dirty. And the Levite's thinking the same thing. Like, if I help this guy, then I'm going to get dirty. I think sometimes as Christians and as churches, we're unwilling to help people because of our own religion gets in our way. It's like, well, I've got to go get to church. I've got to go be with Jesus. I don't have time for this person. It gets in the way. Or sometimes it's like, man, I don't want that person to get me dirty. Like, I'm kind of afraid that their sin might rub off on me, that their messiness might get me messy. Or sometimes I've seen this happen that would be like, well, I don't know if that person would fit very well in our church because, man, they're messy. Just gonna make sure everybody's straight on this. I think we all are. The Rock's a messy place. The Rock is a church full of messy people. We are all dirty people who have found that through Christ, he can take care of my mess. And that's the reason it's like, come on. We've got to make sure we understand that we can't see somebody in need and let our own religion keep us from reaching out and helping them. We got to make sure that we understand, no, I got to follow in Jesus' footsteps. Well, why else do we ignore people sometimes? Why else do we not jump in and help? I think sometimes it's prejudicial thoughts. Do you see somebody and you're like, well, that person's not like me, so I can't help them? Or we see somebody and we think, well, they're in that situation because of their own wrongdoing. They're in that situation because of this in their life. And maybe you stereotype or maybe we kind of have these preconceived ideas and we're unwilling to help because of our own prejudicial thinking about that person. Maybe sometimes we choose to ignore because just ain't got enough time, right? It's like I got no margin in my life whatsoever, and to actually stop and help some person, I don't know if I would be able to get done all these other things I've listed on my to-do list. Guys, I know I wrestle with that, all right? With this building project, I'm like, we got to do this, we got to do this, we got to do this. But I constantly have to remember, project, good, people, better. And we need to keep that mindset. But sometimes, like, we don't stop and help because our projects get in the way of serving people. Maybe we don't help because of fear. Like, you look at that person who's maybe in help. Maybe it's a loved one. Maybe it's a best friend. Maybe it's a neighbor. Maybe it's a coworker. Maybe it's somebody you don't know. And if you don't know them, you're just like, well, I don't know how they'll respond if I try to help. Or I don't really know much about that person, and you allow fear to hit you. Or maybe it's this idea of being overwhelmed by a person's situation. You're like, well, where in the world would I even start? I mean, this person has so many different needs. What do I do? You look at our world in need right now. You look at our country in need right now. And we could look at our country and we go, oh, there's so much need. Where in the world would I even begin? And you almost get overwhelmed to the point that it kind of gives you paralysis. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, I don't even know where to start. Start with one. Just start with one. You know, the Samaritan in the story, he saw the man. When he saw them, he started with one. He saw that the guy had some needs. Now, he could have been overwhelmed by the point. He could have been like, man, this road really needs some more light. And we need to get some more, like, light on this road. And we need to get a lot more, safety. If we could get some, safety officers throughout this place, and if we could, make this road a safer place. You know what I mean? Like, all those things could have overwhelmed him. But instead, he just goes, no, there's just a dude in need. I'm just going to start with helping the guy. Start with one. Because that's what Jesus did, right? Jesus sees the one and says, how can I help? All through the gospel stories about Jesus, you see this. And Jesus comes across a guy named Zacchaeus. Now, Zacchaeus is known as a wee little guy. I remember the first time I ever taught that story was when I was in my first youth ministry. I don't know if you know the story of Zacchaeus. I'll get to it. But the first time I taught this story was down in southern Indiana. And then all of a sudden, this little girl runs up to her daddy at church, and she's like, Daddy, 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 I learned about the wee little man today. Her dad was like, who? Like Zacchaeus? She goes, I don't know his name. He's a wee little man. She's like, well, how'd you hear about the wee little man? He goes, the wee little man, and pointed at me. I still haven't forgiven that little girl. But Zacchaeus, he was a little guy. And Jesus was passing through town. And as Jesus was passing through town, Zacchaeus wanted to see him. So Zacchaeus climbed up in this tree. And as Jesus was going through this land and all of these people were crowding around him, Jesus saw the one. And he reached out to Zacchaeus. He said, Zacchaeus, come down, man. I want to go hang out with you today. One day, Jesus is walking along the road. He's got tons of people around him, but he sees this one guy sitting at a tax collector's booth. He says, Matthew, hey, dude, why don't you get up and why don't you start following me? Everybody else avoiding Matthew. Nobody wants to talk with Matthew. Everybody's calling Matthew an outcast, but Jesus notices the one. Jesus walking through a crowd, people pressing all around him. And this little lady who's had this issue of bleeding for 12 years reaches through the crowd and touches the cloak of his garment, and Jesus stops. And he says, who's the one? Who's the one who touched me? I want to meet you. A prostitute shows up in a gathering of men eating dinner. She's hiding out, doesn't want anybody to notice her. She comes into the room, now everybody can see her. But Jesus is the one who truly sees her. He sees the one. Jesus walking along the road, he's hanging out with a bunch of people. On the other side of the road, there's a lady. She's a widow. She's lost her husband, and now she's lost her only son. A little funeral procession going on. And in Luke chapter 7, we see this story. It says that Jesus stopped. He saw her. Jesus sees the one. So my first challenge to all of us is, let's see the one. And I don't know who the one is. It might be a loved one. It might be somebody you're real close to. It might be somebody you have no clue who they are. But let's allow ourselves to see the one and see people the way God sees them. But man, here's a challenge. What you see, it'll break your heart. What you see should break your heart and move your heart. When the Samaritan saw the guy on the side of the road, it said he felt compassion for him. When Jesus saw the woman at the funeral, it said that he saw her and his heart went out to her. When you see people the way God sees them, it should break your heart. And guys, I'll be honest, I'm an emotional person. Like, I cry a lot. Just confession time, sorry. Confessing in front of a bunch of men right now, I know. This past week, I was preaching in front of about 2,000 high school students. Tuesday night, I'm bawling like a baby on stage. I cry. I watch a good movie, I cry. I watch a good TV show, I cry. I hear a good story, I cry, all right? Go to funerals, cry. Go to weddings, cry. Why we cry at weddings? Like, poor dude. You know what I mean? You get it. Maybe you're like me, maybe you're not. But let me at least ask this question. When was the last time that your heart broke for someone else? Not when was the last time your heart broke for the situation you were going through. No, when was the last time your heart broke because you heard somebody just lost a loved one? When was the last time your heart broke because you heard somebody got a bad medical report? When was the last time that you cried, that you wept, that you prayed for that person when you heard that they lost their job and they're just in a lot of stress right now? When was the last time that maybe you allowed your heart just to break for our country? I know it's easy to throw our hands up in the air about our country right now and our political mess and all that, but has our heart broke for our country? Has our heart broke just for people who lost loved ones and for our police force this week? Is our heart breaking for our nation? Is our heart breaking for our town? Is our heart breaking for churches that are going through hardship? Because when Jesus sees people, his heart breaks. Matthew chapter 9 says this. It's in verse 36. When he meaning Jesus, saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were confused and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. His heart broke for the people. There's another story about how when Jesus was coming into Jerusalem, it was time for the triumphal entry. He knew it was coming into the last week of his life here on earth. But as he came into Jerusalem, he was on the edge of the mountain. He was looking over the city. And it says he looked over the city and he wept. And he said, if you had only have known what could bring you peace. God's heart breaks for his people. What you see should break your heart. But what you feel, it has to move your hands. What you feel has to move your hands. Because here's the truth about Jesus is that when he looked over the city and he said that, his heart broke. And he knew he was coming into the last week of his life. He knew that they were going to take him to the cross. He knew that if he came down that mountain, that they were going to sentence him to be crucified. But Jesus said, okay, I'm coming because my heart breaks for you. I'm going to come and give you what you need. The Good Samaritan, he looked at this guy on the side of the road. And his heart broke for him. He had compassion on him. Now, remember the situation. He's a Samaritan. He sees a Jew in need. These are two races that hate each other, especially the Jews towards the Samaritans. But in the midst of this racial tension, the Samaritan sees the Jew in need and says, how do I serve? And he used his hands to take care of this man's needs. What we see should break our heart, but what we feel has to move our hands. We have to be willing to help people. And again, whether that's a loved one or whether that's someone you don't even know. Now, how do you do that? Well, look at the Samaritan. One, he helped with the immediate need. The immediate need was this guy needed to be bandaged. The immediate need was this guy needed to be cared for. But at the same time, he also took care of long-term needs because then he took him to the inn and provided a space for him to stay. And when it comes to helping people, you start with the immediate need. And then you build a relationship so that you can truly discover what is the long-term need. And my challenge to you is that, or my challenge to us is a better way to say that, is for us to look at people that way, to notice them and say, how do I help with the immediate? And then how do I help with the long term? I want to show you a video here in a second. It's about a group of rockers who are helping with just some immediate needs. They've seen some people and said, man, we need to step into the gap here, and we need to take care of some people and the needs that they are having in this moment. Why don't you check out this video? It'll explain it.
We've been here at the master's table for about 3 years now. My 12-year-old actually had asked me if we could volunteer somewhere. We had done some handing out boxes at Thanksgiving, and he really enjoyed it. And about a couple days later, one of my friends posted on Facebook and said, hey, we need help here at the master's table. So my group decided to take it on.
We meet as a small group 3 Sundays a month, and then 1 Saturday a month we come here, so as a small group. And then it turned into, every Saturday thing, and then it turned into, this master's table, this is what we have to do.
Back here we have 2 major freezers. We have all desserts and breads back here. We have a crew back here that helps fill all the carts and gets the food out to the front for them. And then this is the main area here with more freezers filled with meat. Assembly line for all your canned goods, your dry goods. They put them all into boxes, topped off with frozen meats, and then the desserts and bread are handed out at the front yard with them.
If you want to come out here and hand out boxes, if you want to hand out cold water anywhere, if you want to just walk up to someone and tell them, hey, God loves you, I love you too, it's feet to dirt.
You never know what your smile will do, how, someone who was about to give up, and you gave them a smile and you handed them some food, and now they've got some hope, and it makes a huge difference in their lives.
You just never know. You never know what just taking care of somebody's immediate need might do. You just never know what taking care of somebody's long-term need might do. To help in the immediate, you just see it and you just go, let's dig in. To help in the long term, you build relationship. And as you build relationship, you're able to see this is what this person needs long term. But we got to do it because you just never know. You see, Jesus, when he saw this funeral going on that we talk about in Luke 7, it says he saw the woman and his heart went out to her. But he didn't let it stop there. No, he used his hands. It says that he walked over to the coffin, he placed his hand on the coffin, and he said, young man, get up. And he raised this widow's son back to life. I mean, she's on the edge, she's on the brink. And Jesus stepped in, gave him life, which gave her life. You might not be able to raise somebody physically from the dead. But who knows how you might save somebody from death emotionally or spiritually. You see, there's some people that you might come in contact with who are just on the edge, who are just on the brink, who are at that emotional point where they just go, I just feel like giving up. I just feel like the deck is stacked against me. And you might intercept their life, and you might not even realize you're doing it, but you might come across at the perfect time, and you might save somebody from emotional death. You might save somebody from physical death. You might show up at a point where they were actually contemplating taking their life, but because you step in, life gets changed. You might step into somebody's life that has no hope because they have no Christ in their life. And you might be able to save somebody from spiritual death. See, here's what I believe. That is, if we as a people will say, God, open my eyes. And help me to see people the way you see them. Allow my heart to break for them and my hands to move for them. Then this is what I believe will happen. God will answer your prayer, and then he'll put somebody in your path. That person he puts in your path might be a dear loved one. Or that person he puts in your path might be an absolute stranger. But God will place somebody in your path. Will we take time to notice? Will we do something about it? And will we save them? You start with one, because that's what God did. You see, he saw a whole world in need. But when he saw a whole world in need, he also saw individuals in need. And here's the reality about God, is that when God saw a world in need and individuals in need, he saw you in need. Back before any of us were ever created, before any of us were ever born, before any of us took a first breath of air, God saw your spiritual need. And that's the reason Jesus came out of heaven, came down to this earth, was born, lived a life. In his life, he took care of people's individual needs. He reached out to those who were hurting, those who were outcast. To the point that the religious leaders of the time, they were frustrated, they were upset, and they sentenced Jesus to be crucified. They beat him, and then they took him to the hill. They stretched out his arm, and they stuck that nail through his wrist, his hand. And in that moment, Jesus used his hands to save us, to save you, to save me. This morning, I just want you to know, man, if you don't have a relationship with Jesus Christ, if you haven't grabbed a hold of the hand of God, then he's ready to do that for you today. He wants to restore that relationship. He wants to bring you from death to life, because his heart breaks for you. And this morning, you can start that relationship with Jesus by just simply saying a prayer, by just saying, God, I need you. A simple prayer of just, God, I need you. Guys, I will tell you that myself, our prayer counselors, we would love to help you say that prayer. And you can just meet us right over here against the wall. We'd love to pray with you and help you do that. And just as God has saved many of you, then the prayer this morning needs to be this, is God, help me to do that for others. Help me to help connect others back unto you, God. So open my eyes, open my heart, use my hands. Would you guys do me a favor? Let's go ahead and stand up. We're going to go into a time of response. If you'd like to take communion, there's communion up to the right and to the left. We would love to help you do that. You can just go and do that when you feel like you need it. If you want to pray with somebody, like I said, I'll be over here. If you're at C3, I know Clay's there, and he'd be willing to pray with you as well. But let's spend some time recognizing that God loves you. He wants to save you, and his heart breaks for you, and his hands move for you. And then let's ask God to help us to go and do the same for others. Why don't you pray with me if you would? Father God, I thank you for this morning. God, I thank you that we can come into your presence, that we can worship, that we can celebrate. God, I thank you that you care about us as an individual, so much so that you were willing to die for me. God, I am so unworthy, but I am so thankful. God, help me to go and do likewise to others and to help them find what I have found in you. God, I pray that for all of us. In your son's name, amen. Let's respond.